August 17, 1945. 3 months after the war ended, a German U-boat surfaced in Argentina, unannounced, unexpected, and impossible. Every Nazi submarine had been sunk, scuttled, or surrendered. This one should not exist. Inside, 32 gaunt bearded men squinted at sunlight they hadn't seen in 66 days. Their young commander refused to explain where they'd been or what they carried. Allied intelligence rushed to Argentina with one terrifying question. Did U-977 carry Adolf Hitler to safety? Newspapers exploded with conspiracy theories. The submarine was searched stem to stern. The crew was separated and interrogated for months. But the timeline didn't add up. The ship's log revealed a journey far longer than any direct route. And the condition of those men told a darker story. One of desperation, fear, and a choice made in the chaos of war's end. What really happened aboard U-977 during those 108 days at sea? And what were they running from? Before we dive in, hit subscribe for more untold stories where the history books buried the details that mattered most. And drop a comment. Let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. August 17, 1945. The war had been over for 3 months. In the harbor of Mar del Plata, Argentina, a fishing port 200 miles south of Buenos Aires, the morning sun climbed over calm waters. Fishermen prepared their nets. Dock workers loaded crates. It was an ordinary day in a neutral nation that had watched the world burn from a comfortable distance. Then, without warning, something broke the surface a half-mile from shore. At first, it looked like a whale, a dark mass rising from the depths, shedding seawater in silver streams. But whales don't have conning towers, and they don't fly German naval ensigns. The rusty, barnacle-encrusted hull of a Type 7C U-boat rolled into full view, diesel engines coughing black smoke into the Argentine sky. On the docks, men stopped working. Fingers pointed, radios crackled to life. Within minutes, Argentine naval patrol boats scrambled from their moorings, racing toward the impossible vessel. The submarine moved slowly, almost deliberately, toward the harbor entrance. It was limping. Even from a distance, the damage was visible. Streaks of rust, dented plating, a periscope bent at an unnatural angle. This was not a proud warship. This was a survivor. As the patrol boats drew alongside, the conning tower hatch creaked open. A young man emerged, blinking against the sunlight like a creature pulled from a cave. His uniform was stained and salt-crusted. His face was gaunt, covered in a scraggly beard that made him look older than his 24 years. Oberleutnant Heinz Schaefer raised one hand in a gesture that was neither surrender nor salute, just acknowledgement. Behind him, more men climbed onto the deck. One by one, they stumbled into the open air, shielding their eyes, gasping at the wind. 32 men in total. Some could barely stand. One sailor collapsed immediately and had to be helped to his feet by his crewmates. They looked like ghosts, pale, hollow-eyed, moving as if their bodies had forgotten how to exist in sunlight. The smell hit the Argentine boarding party before they even climbed aboard. Diesel fuel, human waste, rotting food, sweat and mildew, and something worse, the accumulated stench of men trapped in a steel tube for far too long. One Argentine officer covered his mouth with a handkerchief. Another gagged and turned away. Inside the submarine, conditions were worse. The cramped interior was a chaos of rust and grime. Mold clung to the walls, water sloshed in the bilges. Food tins lay scattered across the deck plates. The crew's bunks were damp and reeking. This was not a vessel that had surrendered in orderly fashion 3 months earlier. This was a submarine that had been at sea far longer than it should have been. Schaefer was taken ashore immediately. Through a translator, he made a simple request: political asylum for himself and his crew. The Argentine authorities, caught completely off guard, had no idea what to do with him. They placed him under guard and began making calls. Within hours, word reached Buenos Aires. Within a day, it reached Washington and London. Within a week, British and American intelligence officers were on planes bound for Argentina, carrying files, photographs, and a growing list of questions. The timing was impossible to ignore. Germany had surrendered on May 8, 1945. Every German U-boat still at sea had received Admiral Karl Dönitz's order to surface, cease hostilities, and report to the nearest Allied port. Most had complied. Some had scuttled themselves rather than surrender. A handful had tried to run and been hunted down. But U-977 had vanished. No distress signal. No surrender. No sinking. It had simply disappeared from the war's final roster, unaccounted for and presumed lost. Until now. The interrogations began in a windowless room in a naval facility outside Mar del Plata. Schaefer sat across from a British naval intelligence officer and an American counterpart from the Office of Strategic Services. They spoke through a translator, though Schaefer's English was passable. The first questions were procedural. When did you leave Norway? May 2, 1945. Where did you go? South. Across the Atlantic. Why Argentina? It was neutral. We believed we would be safe. The officers took notes. Then the harder questions began. Why did it take you 108 days to reach Argentina? The direct route should have taken perhaps 30 days, maybe 40 if you were cautious. Schaefer's answer was calm, almost rehearsed. We traveled submerged. We used our snorkel device to remain underwater as long as possible. We wanted to avoid Allied patrols. The British officer leaned forward. For 108 days? Schaefer nodded. 66 days submerged without surfacing. Then the final leg to Argentina. The Americans exchanged glances. That was theoretically possible with a snorkel, but the human cost would have been staggering. And it still didn't explain the delays. Then came the question that had been whispered in Washington, London, and Moscow since the moment U-977's surfaced. Were you carrying anyone? Schaefer looked genuinely confused. Carrying? High-ranking officials, Nazi leadership. The officer paused. Adolf Hitler. For the first time, Schaefer's composure cracked. He almost laughed, a bitter, exhausted sound. No, no one. Just my crew. The officer pressed. Are you certain? Schaefer's voice hardened. Hitler was dead before we even left Norway. We carried no one. The interrogation continued for hours, then days. The crew was separated and questioned individually. Their stories matched. Every man told the same tale, a desperate flight from what they believed would be brutal captivity, a grueling voyage underwater, and a hope that Argentina would offer sanctuary. But the world in 1945 was hungry for mysteries. Hitler's body had been recovered by the Soviets but not conclusively identified to Western satisfaction. Rumors swirled of escape routes through Spain, through Switzerland, through submarine. South America, with its German expatriate communities and ambiguous politics, seemed a logical destination for fleeing Nazis. Newspapers seized on the story. Mystery U-boat surfaces in Argentina. Did Hitler escape on U-977? Nazi submarines' secret cargo. The headlines wrote themselves, and in the interrogation rooms, intelligence officers searched for cracks in Schaefer's story, for inconsistencies, for any shred of evidence that U-977 had been more than a desperate gamble by frightened men. They found none, but they kept looking. To understand why U-977 surfaced in Argentina in August 1945, you must first understand the moment when its journey began, and the choice that set everything in motion. May 2nd, 1945. Kristiansand, Norway. The war was dying, but it wasn't dead yet. U-977, a Type Seeving Sea submarine, slipped out of the Norwegian harbor on what was officially logged as a combat patrol. It was an aging workhorse, one of hundreds built during the war, equipped with the newer snorkel breathing device that allowed it to run diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth. The crew numbered 48 men, most of them young, many barely out of their teens. Their commander, Heinz Schaefer, was 24 years old, a veteran by U-boat standards, but still young enough to believe in choices. They didn't know it yet, but they were sailing into the last days of the Third Reich. Germany was collapsing. Soviet forces had taken Berlin. Hitler was dead, though that news hadn't reached every corner of the crumbling Nazi empire. In Norway, German forces still held territory, but everyone knew it was only a matter of days, perhaps hours, before the surrender order came. Schaefer knew it too. As U-977's submerged and began its patrol into the North Atlantic, he carried with him not just orders, but doubts. The order came on May 5th. Admiral Karl Dönitz, now the nominal head of what remained of Germany, transmitted a message to all U-boats still at sea. Cease hostilities immediately. Surface, fly a black flag of surrender, and report to the nearest Allied port. For most U-boat commanders, the order was clear. The war was over. Surrender was the only option. Some complied immediately. Others scuttled their boats rather than hand them over to the enemy. But for Schaefer, the order triggered something else, a fear that had been building for months, fed by years of propaganda and the growing desperation of a losing war. He gathered his crew in the cramped forward torpedo room. 48 men pressed together, silent, waiting. Schaefer explained the situation. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. Dönitz had ordered all submarines to give themselves up. But then Schaefer did something unusual. He told them what he believed would happen if they obeyed. He spoke of Soviet captivity, the brutal labor camps, the stories of German prisoners worked to death in Siberia. He spoke of the Morgenthau Plan, a proposed Allied policy that German propaganda had twisted into a nightmare vision of mass enslavement and castration of German men. It was propaganda, exaggerated and distorted, but to men who had spent years hearing nothing but Goebbels' lies, it felt real. Schaefer didn't present these fears as facts, but he didn't dismiss them either. And then he offered an alternative. Argentina, a neutral nation, a place where German expatriates had built communities, a country that might grant them asylum and allow them to wait out the chaos until it was safe to return home or to start new lives if returning became impossible. It was 7,500 nautical miles away. It would require traveling submerged for much of the journey to avoid Allied patrols. They would have to ration food and water. They would be pushing the submarine and themselves to the absolute limit. And there was no guarantee Argentina would take them. Schaefer looked at his crew and told them the truth. He didn't know if this was the right choice, but he believed they deserved to make it themselves. In an almost unprecedented move for a German military vessel, he put it to a vote. 48 men, 48 decisions. Some didn't hesitate. The younger sailors, those with nothing waiting for them in Germany but rubble and occupation, voted immediately to go. Others took longer. The older men, the married ones, those with families they hadn't seen in years, they struggled. For them, the choice wasn't between surrender and freedom. It was between uncertainty and home. When the votes were counted, the result was clear but not unanimous. 30 men chose Argentina. 16 chose to return and surrender. 2 more would later decide to stay with the boat, bringing the final crew to 32. Schaefer honored the decision. On May 10, 1945, under cover of darkness, U-977's surfaced near the Norwegian island of Holsøy. The 16 men who had voted to surrender gathered their belongings, small bags, letters, photographs. There were no speeches, no dramatic farewells, just handshakes and quiet words. Some of the men leaving looked relieved. Others looked ashamed, though they had no reason to be. The men staying watched from the conning tower as their former crewmates rowed a small dinghy toward the rocky shore. Within hours, those 16 men would find their way to Allied forces and enter the standard process of surrender and repatriation. Their war was over in the traditional sense. For the 32 men who remained aboard U-977, a different kind of war was just beginning. Schaefer stood on the bridge as the submarine submerged once more. The Norwegian coast disappeared behind them. Ahead lay the open Atlantic, hostile and vast. Above them, the world was celebrating. VE Day had come and gone. The war in Europe was finished. But below the surface, 32 men in a steel tube were starting a journey that would take them further from home than any of them had ever imagined. The decision haunted Schaefer immediately. As the submarine descended and the diesels hummed through the snorkel, he replayed the vote in his mind. Had he manipulated them? Had he exaggerated the risk of surrender to justify his own fear? Or had he given them a genuine choice in a moment when choices were rare? He didn't know. What he did know was that he was now responsible for 32 lives in a way that went beyond normal command. They had trusted him. They had followed him into the unknown. And if he was wrong, if Argentina turned them away, if the journey killed them, if the world they arrived in was worse than the one they'd fled, it would be his fault. The crew settled into a routine, but it was a routine built on tension. They were no longer at war, but they were also not at peace. They were fugitives from nothing and headed toward uncertainty. Some men second-guessed their vote immediately. Others threw themselves into the work, into the mechanics of keeping the boat running, as a way to avoid thinking about what they'd done. In the engine room, the machinist's mates monitored the diesels. In the control room, the plainsman held the boat steady at periscope depth. In the galley, the cook rationed food that was meant to last weeks, knowing it would have to stretch for months. And in the commander's cabin, Schaefer wrote in the ship's log, recording their position, their course, and nothing about the fear that grew with every nautical mile they traveled south. The North Atlantic was empty. The patrols they feared never came. The war was over, and the Allies had better things to do than hunt for a single unaccounted-for U-boat. But Schaefer didn't know that. None of them did. So they stayed down, running submerged, breathing stale air and pushing deeper into a journey that would test them in ways combat never had. The journey that Heinz Schaefer would later describe as 66 consecutive days submerged began as a calculated risk and became a descent into a very particular kind of hell. The snorkel device made it theoretically possible. A retractable tube that extended above the surface, allowing the submarine to draw in fresh air and run its diesel engines while remaining submerged at periscope depth. It was a technological advantage that had come too late in the war to matter strategically, but for U-977, it was the only reason the journey was even conceivable. Without it, they would have been forced to surface regularly to recharge batteries and ventilate the boat, exposing themselves to detection. With it, they could stay down indefinitely. But technology and human endurance are two different things. Within the first week, the reality of what they'd chosen began to settle over the crew like a weight. The submarine was never designed for extended habitation. A Type 7C was a weapon built for short patrols and quick strikes, not for months at sea. Every surface was metal. Every space was cramped. The hull diameter was barely 20 feet, and most of that was taken up by machinery, torpedoes, and stores. The crew lived in the leftover spaces, bunks stacked 3 high, so narrow a man had to slide in sideways, hammocks strung in the torpedo room, a tiny galley where the cook worked in a space smaller than a closet. And now, submerged with no access to sunlight or fresh air, beyond what the schnorchel could provide, that cramped space became a prison. The air was the first thing to break them down. The snorkel helped, but it wasn't perfect. When seas were rough, waves would crash over the intake, triggering an automatic valve that sealed it shut to prevent flooding. When that happened, the diesels kept running, sucking air from inside the submarine instead. The effect was immediate and brutal, a sudden drop in cabin pressure that made ears pop and lungs strain. Men would gasp, clutching their chests until the valve reopened and pressure equalized. It happened dozens of times a day. Even when the snorkel was working properly, the air inside was never truly fresh. It was heavy, damp, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, diesel fumes, battery acid, and human waste. The single toilet served 32 men and could only be flushed under specific pressure conditions. Mistakes were common, and the consequences were humiliating and nauseating. Carbon dioxide levels rose steadily despite the ventilation system. Headaches became constant. Men moved sluggishly, their thoughts clouded, their reactions slow. Some developed a persistent cough that never quite went away. The humidity was equally relentless. Condensation formed on every metal surface, dripping constantly. Clothing never dried. Mold grew in the bunks, on the bulkheads, on stored food. Skin broke out in rashes and fungal infections. There were no showers, no way to wash properly. Men wiped themselves down with rags soaked in seawater, but it did little to help. Within 2 weeks, every man aboard reeked. Within a month, they'd stopped noticing. The psychological toll came more slowly but cut deeper. Humans need sunlight. They need open space. They need the rhythm of day and night. U-977's crew had none of these things. Below decks, time became abstract. The boat operated on watch schedules, 4 hours on, 8 hours off, but without external cues, the days bled together. Some men stopped sleeping properly. Others slept too much, retreating into unconsciousness as an escape. One sailor, a 20-year-old machinist's mate named Klaus, developed severe claustrophobia 3 weeks into the voyage. He'd been fine during combat patrols, fine during training, but something about the endless submersion broke him. He began hyperventilating during his watch, convinced the walls were closing in. He had to be restrained when he tried to force open the hatch. Schaefer had him sedated with what limited medical supplies they had and reassigned him to duties that kept him away from the narrowest compartments. But there was no treatment for what Klaus was experiencing, only management, and everyone aboard knew they were one crisis away from more men breaking the same way. Discipline became Schaefer's obsession. He enforced routines with rigid precision because routine was the only thing holding them together. Watches were maintained exactly. Meals were served at the same time every day, even when the food was reduced to hardtack and canned meat. Bunks were inspected. Equipment was maintained. Schaefer walked through the boat constantly, talking to his men, checking their state of mind as much as their work. He knew that if order collapsed, everything would collapse. But order couldn't stop the arguments. In a space that small, with that much stress, conflict was inevitable. Men fought over nothing: whose turn it was to use the toilet, who had taken the last tin of sardines, who was breathing too loudly in the bunks at night. Fistfights broke out twice, quickly broken up, but leaving resentments that festered. Some men stopped speaking to each other entirely, creating silent feuds that divided the already tiny crew into factions. Others clung together, forming bonds that were part brotherhood and part survival pact. The cook, a middle-aged man named Friedrich, who had voted to come despite having a wife and daughter in Hamburg, became an unlikely source of morale. He hoarded small luxuries: a hidden bar of chocolate, a tin of real coffee, a jar of preserved peaches, and doled them out on birthdays or when spirits were at their lowest. When one sailor turned 21 during the voyage, Friedrich produced a single piece of chocolate, broke it into 32 pieces, and distributed it among the entire crew. It was a ridiculous gesture, a fragment of sweetness that did nothing to fill their stomachs, but men wept as they ate it. Music helped, too. One of the crewmen, a torpedo man named Ernst, had brought a harmonica. In the evenings, between watches, he would play slow, melancholy songs from home, folk tunes their mothers had sung, marches from a war that already felt like ancient history. The sound filled the submarine, tinny and mournful, and for a few minutes the men could close their eyes and pretend they were somewhere else. There were moments of genuine terror. Twice, the hydrophone operator detected propeller sounds overhead, distant but unmistakable. Allied patrol vessels, probably routine sweeps, but U-977 had no way to know for certain. Schaefer ordered silent running. The diesels shut down, the electric motors cut to minimum speed. Every man froze. No one spoke. No one moved. They drifted in the dark water, listening to the screws pass overhead, praying they wouldn't be noticed. Both times the sounds faded. Both times the crew exhaled in unison. But the fear lingered. Once, a mechanical failure nearly forced them to surface in broad daylight. A valve in the engine room seized, causing a pressure spike that threatened to shut down the entire propulsion system. The chief engineer, a gruff veteran named Otto, spent 6 hours flat on his back in a space barely wide enough for his shoulders, jury-rigging a repair with wire and solder. When he finally crawled out, covered in grease and sweat, he said nothing, just nodded at Schaefer and went to his bunk. The submarine kept running. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. They passed the equator in mid-July, a milestone that should have been celebrated but passed in near silence. The heat in the southern latitudes was unbearable. The hull radiated warmth. Men stripped to their underwear, but it didn't help. Tempers frayed further. Rations ran lower. By early August, they were eating once a day, stale bread, canned fish, water that tasted of rust and salt. Some men lost 20 pounds. Others developed scurvy from the lack of fresh food. And still they kept going, pushing south along the coast of South America, driven by a hope that was becoming harder to hold on to with every mile. On August 17th, after 108 days at sea, 66 of them submerged, with only brief, furtive surfaces for navigation and the rumored stop at Cape Verde. U-977 finally reached Argentine waters. When Schaefer gave the order to surface, some men couldn't move. They sat in their stations, staring at nothing, too exhausted to feel relief. Others climbed topside and collapsed on the deck, sobbing. They had survived, but what they'd survived had left marks that would never fully heal. The interrogations lasted for months, and they were relentless. Heinz Schaefer sat across from British and American intelligence officers in rotating shifts, answering the same questions over and over, his story dissected and cross-referenced against every piece of evidence the Allies could gather. His crew was separated immediately upon arrival. In Argentina, each man questioned individually to prevent coordination of false testimony. The Allies were looking for inconsistencies, for cracks in the narrative, for any shred of proof that U-977 had been more than a desperate flight by frightened men. The conspiracy theories had taken on a life of their own. In the chaos of 1945, with Hitler's fate still uncertain in Western minds and rumors of Nazi escape routes proliferating across 2 continents, U-977 became a lightning rod for every suspicion and fear. The timing seemed too convenient. The route seemed too long. The explanation seemed too simple. Intelligence agencies in Washington, London, and Moscow all reached the same conclusion independently. Something didn't add up. The most persistent theory was the most sensational, that U-977 had carried Adolf Hitler himself to safety in South America. The timeline was scrutinized obsessively. Hitler had died on April 30, 1945, in his bunker beneath Berlin. U-977 had departed Norway on May 2nd. That gave a 48-hour window. Could Hitler have been transported from Berlin to the Norwegian coast in that time? It was theoretically possible, though wildly improbable. The Soviet army had surrounded Berlin. Escape routes were cut off. And yet, because Hitler's body had been recovered by the Soviets and not shown to Western authorities, doubt persisted. Schaefer's denials were consistent but did nothing to quiet the speculation. He told his interrogators exactly what had happened. U-977 had left on a routine patrol, received the surrender order at sea, and made the decision to flee based on fear of captivity and propaganda about Allied intentions. There had been no passengers, no secret cargo, no mission beyond survival. But consistency wasn't the same as proof, and in the absence of definitive evidence, the conspiracy theories flourished. The submarine itself was searched with a thoroughness that bordered on destruction. Argentine authorities allowed British and American technical teams aboard within days of U-977's arrival. Every compartment was inspected. Every locker was opened. Every panel was removed. They were looking for hidden spaces, for evidence of modifications that might have accommodated passengers, for any sign that the submarine had carried something or someone it wasn't supposed to. They found nothing. The boat was exactly what it appeared to be, a standard Type C-7C submarine, worn and battered from months at sea but unmodified. There were no secret compartments, no false bulkheads, no hidden cargo. The only things aboard were the tools and supplies needed to keep the boat running and 32 men alive. The food stores were nearly depleted, exactly as Schaefer had claimed. The fuel tanks were almost empty. The condition of the crew matched the condition of the boat. Both had been pushed to the absolute limit. Investigators examined the ship's log with particular care. Every entry was checked against a known U-boat. Procedures. Every position was plotted on charts. The log showed a voyage that began in Norway, proceeded southwest through the North Atlantic, passed through the Mid-Atlantic, and continued south along the coast of Africa and South America before turning west toward Argentina. The dates and distances matched Schaefer's testimony. There were gaps, periods where no position was recorded, presumably when the submarine was running submerged and unable to take navigational fixes, but nothing that suggested deception. If anything, the log was almost boring in its consistency. It read like exactly what it was, the meticulous record of a long, grinding voyage with no dramatic incidents and no secret detours. The crew's testimonies were equally consistent. Each man was questioned separately, often for hours at a time, by interrogators trained to spot lies and contradictions. They were asked about the departure from Norway, about the vote to flee to Argentina, about the conditions during the voyage, about whether they had seen or heard anything unusual. Their answers varied in detail but aligned on every major point. They had voted to go. They had traveled submerged for most of the journey. They had suffered but survived, and they had carried nothing and no one beyond themselves. Some of the men were more forthcoming than others. A few resented the interrogations and answered in terse, hostile monosyllables. Others seemed almost relieved to talk, unburdening themselves of the isolation and fear they'd carried for months. But none of them broke. None of them contradicted the core story. After weeks of interrogation, the Allied intelligence officers began to reach an uncomfortable conclusion. Schaefer was telling the truth. There was no conspiracy. U-977 had not carried Hitler or any other high-ranking Nazi official. It had not transported gold or looted art or secret weapons technology. It had simply been a submarine full of young men who had made a choice based on fear and misinformation and who had paid a brutal price for that choice. The conclusion was anticlimactic and it didn't satisfy everyone. Some intelligence officers remained convinced there was more to the story, that Schaefer was simply too disciplined to crack. But without evidence, suspicion was meaningless. By late 1945, the official position of both British and American intelligence was clear. U-977 represented no conspiracy, posed no ongoing threat, and held no secrets worth pursuing. The crew were not war criminals. They were simply submariners who had outlasted the war. But the conclusion brought no relief to the men of U-977. They remained in custody, first in Argentina, then transferred to American and British control as diplomatic negotiations ground forward. Their legal status was ambiguous. Were they prisoners of war? Technically, the war had been over when they arrived in Argentina. Were they deserters? They had fled after receiving the surrender order, but they hadn't fled from combat. Were they asylum seekers? Argentina had initially seemed willing to grant them refuge, but international pressure from the Allies made that politically untenable. So they remained in limbo, held without clear charges, waiting for bureaucrats and diplomats to decide their fate. Letters from home began to arrive, forwarded through Red Cross channels. Some men learned their families had survived the war. Others learned they hadn't. One sailor received word that his wife had been killed in the bombing of Hamburg 6 months earlier, before he'd even left Norway. He'd fled to protect a future that no longer existed. Another learned his parents' home had been destroyed and they were living in a refugee camp. The news came in fragments, each letter bringing a small piece of the devastation they'd been trying to escape. Some of the men regretted their choice immediately. Others defended it fiercely. Arguments broke out among the crew, old tensions from the voyage resurfacing in new forms. Schaefer found himself blamed by some and thanked by others, often by the same men on different days. He had promised them safety and instead he'd delivered them to months of interrogation and an uncertain future. But he'd also kept them alive when surrender might have meant years in Soviet labor camps. There was no clear verdict on whether he'd been right or wrong, and the ambiguity ate at him. By mid-1946, most of the crew had been cleared for repatriation. They were released from custody and allowed to return to Germany, or what was left of it. They traveled home on Allied ships alongside other prisoners of war, returning to a country divided into occupation zones, its cities in ruins, its economy shattered. For men who had spent months at sea imagining their homecoming, the reality was devastating. Jobs were scarce, food was rationed, the social fabric had been torn apart, and U-977's crew carried an additional burden, the stigma of their flight. In a nation trying to rebuild its dignity, they were reminders of fear and failure. Some were accused of cowardice, of running while others had faced the consequences of defeat. Others were viewed with suspicion, tainted by the conspiracy theories that had surrounded the submarine. A few found sympathy, people who understood that the choice they'd made had been born of desperation, not malice. But sympathy didn't provide jobs or rebuild lives. The men scattered across Germany, trying to reintegrate into a world that had moved on without them. Some succeeded, others struggled for years, and all of them carried the memory of those 66 days submerged, a time when they had been bound together by shared suffering and a choice they couldn't undo. Heinz Schaefer returned to Germany in 1947, 2 years after the war's end, stepping off a transport ship into a country he barely recognized. The cities he'd known were rubble. The society he'd left was gone, replaced by occupation zones and ration cards and a population trying to forget what it had been part of. He was 26 years old and carried no rank, no authority, and no clear path forward. The German military had been dissolved. Former officers were viewed with suspicion by the Allied authorities and resentment by civilians who blamed the military for the catastrophe. Schaefer found work where he could, manual labor mostly, unloading cargo, clearing debris from bombed buildings, jobs that required a strong back and no questions about the past. But he couldn't let go of U-977. The voyage haunted him in ways both obvious and subtle. He dreamed about the submarine, about the sound of the diesels, about the faces of his crew and the dim red lighting of the control room. He thought about the men who had voted to stay and wondered if they regretted it. He thought about the 16 who had chosen to leave in Norway and wondered what had become of them. And he thought about whether he'd been right. In 1952, he began writing. It wasn't therapy exactly, though it served that purpose. It was an attempt to set the record straight, to answer the conspiracy theories that still lingered, and to honor the men who had trusted him enough to follow him into the unknown. The book was titled U-Boat 977, and it was published in German first, then translated into English and released internationally. It was part memoir, part defense, part historical document. Schaefer wrote in spare, direct prose, laying out the facts of the voyage without embellishment or melodrama. He described the fear that had driven their decision, the conditions they'd endured, and the aftermath they'd faced. He addressed the Hitler conspiracy directly, stating plainly that they had carried no one, that the timeline made it impossible, and that the entire theory had been a product of post-war paranoia and sensationalism. The book was controversial from the moment it appeared. Some readers saw it as an honest account from a man trying to make sense of an impossible choice. Others saw it as an excuse, a way to justify cowardice or desertion. Veterans who had surrendered in 1945 and spent years in Allied or Soviet captivity resented the implication that Schaefer and his crew had somehow suffered more. Historians debated whether the 66-day submerged record was even accurate, pointing to inconsistencies and the likelihood that U-977 had surfaced briefly or stopped at the Cape Verde Islands, where crew members reportedly swam. Allied intelligence officers who had interrogated Schaefer dismissed parts of the book as self-serving, though they never challenged the core facts. But the book found an audience. In Germany, it sold steadily among readers hungry for first-hand accounts of the war's final days. In Britain and America, it became a minor success in the growing genre of World War II nonfiction, appealing to readers fascinated by submarines and the mysteries of the war's end. Schaefer gave a few interviews, always reluctant, always careful. He refused to apologize for the voyage, but also refused to glorify it. When asked if he would make the same choice again, he said he didn't know. When asked if he regretted it, he said he regretted the suffering his men had endured, but not the intent behind the decision. It was an answer that satisfied no one, but it was honest. The crew of U-977 scattered across post-war Germany and beyond, their lives taking wildly different trajectories. Some rebuilt successfully. Friedrich, the cook who had rationed chocolate and preserved peaches, opened a small restaurant in Hamburg and lived quietly until his death in 1968. Ernst, the torpedo man with the harmonica, became a music teacher and never spoke publicly about the voyage. Otto, the chief engineer who had saved the submarine with wire and solder, found work in the merchant marine and spent the rest of his life at sea, though never again submerged. Others struggled. Klaus, the machinist's mate who had broken down during the voyage, never fully recovered from the psychological damage. He drifted between jobs and cities, unable to settle, haunted by claustrophobia that made even small rooms unbearable. He died in 1961 under circumstances his family preferred not to discuss. Several crew members emigrated, unable to make peace with post-war Germany. Two went to South America, ironically ending up in the region they had once sailed toward in desperation. One moved to Canada, another to Australia. They carried U-977 with them wherever they went, a shared experience that marked them as different from everyone around them. Most of the crew never spoke about the voyage unless asked directly, and even then they were guarded. It was a chapter of their lives that didn't fit into the narrative of post-war reconstruction and moving forward. Germany wanted to forget the war, and a submarine that had fled rather than surrendered was an uncomfortable reminder of fear and confusion at the moment of defeat. A few crew members stayed in touch with Schaefer over the years. They sent letters, usually brief, updating him on their lives and occasionally reflecting on the voyage. Some thanked him, some blamed him. Most did both, depending on the year and their circumstances. Schaefer kept the letters in a folder that grew thicker with time, a testament to the bond they'd formed and the burden they still carried together. The submarine itself met an unceremonious end. After the interrogations and inspections were complete, U-977 was handed over to the United States Navy for technical evaluation. American engineers studied the snorkel system, examined the hull for signs of prolonged submersion, and tested the mechanical systems that had carried the boat across the Atlantic. By late 1946, they'd learned everything they wanted to know. On November 13, 1946, U-977 was towed to a position off the coast of Massachusetts, approximately 40 miles east of Cape Cod. The USS Atule, an American submarine, was given the honor of the kill. A single torpedo struck U-977 amidships. The old submarine, which had survived months at sea and become the center of international conspiracy theories, sank in minutes. It came to rest on the seafloor, depth unrecorded, position not marked with any particular care. It was just another U-boat, and by 1946, there were hundreds of them on the bottom of the Atlantic. No one thought to preserve it. No one imagined anyone would care decades later. It simply disappeared, taking with it the physical evidence of the journey but none of the questions. Heinz Schaefer lived into old age, dying in 1979 at the age of 58. He never fully escaped U-977. The submarine and the voyage defined him for better or worse, and he accepted that. In his final years, he gave occasional interviews to historians and documentary filmmakers, always with the same measured tone, no regrets about the intent, but no pride in the necessity. He maintained until the end that he'd done what he thought was right in an impossible situation, and that history could judge him however it wanted. When he died, his obituary in German newspapers was brief, noting his wartime service and his book, but little else. The crew members who outlived him, roughly half, didn't attend a collective memorial. There was no reunion, no final gathering. They had survived together, but they hadn't stayed together, and perhaps that was fitting. U-977 had been a moment in their lives, not a defining identity, and they'd each moved on in their own ways. But none of them forgot. In interviews conducted decades later, the surviving crew members spoke carefully about the voyage. They described the fear, the suffering, the impossible conditions. They defended Schaefer's leadership while acknowledging the costs of the choice. And they all agreed on one thing. The voyage had been real, the suffering had been real, and the decision had been born of desperation, not conspiracy. History eventually vindicated them, though the vindication came too late to matter much. By the 1970s and 1980s, as archives opened and records were declassified, the full story of U-977 became clear. There had been no Hitler aboard, no treasure, no grand Nazi escape plan. Just 32 men and a choice made in the fog of war's end. The submarine itself remains on the seafloor off Massachusetts, unvisited and largely forgotten. Its exact position was never precisely documented, and no expedition has sought it out. Unlike other famous U-boats that have become dive sites or subjects of deep-sea exploration, U-977 rests in obscurity. Perhaps that's appropriate. It was never a famous boat during the war. Its fame came afterward, born of mystery and speculation, and when the mystery was solved, the interest faded. What remains is the story, a reminder that the end of a war is often more complicated than its beginning, and that the men who fought it carried their choices long after the guns fell silent.